Well, welcome everyone. This is the interview with author Claire Davis, who we're speaking to today. She is in Lewiston, Idaho, and I am actually at Aramont School of Arts and Crafts doing a residency for the week. But thanks to technology, we can connect. So I've sent Claire a few questions ahead of time, and I'm going to read them because myself and my students worked pretty hard to compile them, and I think they're sufficient as they are. So we'll just take it from here, Claire, and if our conversation veers, that's just fine too. I'm really excited to learn.
Okay.
So when you were my advisor at Pacific, which was over 10 years ago now, I graduated in 2008. One thing that I remembered learning from you was to write with precision and abandon.
Yeah.
And I think that instruction came from David Long.
Actually, that one came from James Hazard, who was my poetry teacher back in the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. It was to write with precise abandon, because he would argue that poetry demands it, but I'd say that all writing demands this, that precision of language, that precise way to address a thing or an issue, but also the abandon that poetry brings to it. In other words, not using the predictable language. It may be precise language, but it's by far a far reach from the predictable language. It's that flight, the imaginative leap that poets make, that I work so hard to incorporate within not just my own writing, but in my teaching. How to express something in a way that gives it the thing precisely, but also takes the reader in a very different place, or the writer in a very different space within their head, and makes them look at the world or that object or that person in a different way. That flight of imagination.
And bringing that into prose, and probably likely into the revision process, those later drafts, is that laborious for you, or is that where the real work of the imagination? For me, revision is the best part, but I know for many people, they sort of loathe it. So maybe you can help us turn that on its head a little.
Yeah, I know. And the people I've met that most loathe it are writers who are still in their early years, because they love that energy, that burst of the muse, that moment when you take fire with that creative element in your head. And then they think they throw that away in revision. And the truth is that you tap that much more deeply in revision. And I think the more mature writers understand that when you slow down and give a moment for that work to open up, when you're cutting and changing and tightening it down, and then you let it blow open again in revision or re-envisioning a thing, that same muse, that same generative impulse goes a little deeper and into the language itself, into syntax, perhaps into the image, or finding a new moment internally or externally within the story. So yeah, I'm with you. Revision for me, I can't think of anything more pleasant than not looking at a blank screen page.
Yeah.
The blank page is always daunting, and you have something to work with, and you're free then to really think outside of the box.
Yeah. Awesome. I'm intrigued to hear you say that you incorporate that into your teaching too. I'm a planner, but if I have a plan, then I can veer away from it. Maybe that's a side conversation for me to ask you some other time about how that's worked for you as a teacher. But I can see it, having benefit from your teachings.
Yeah.
I can see how that, always having just a little door open for something that might pop up.
Yeah, always looking not just directly at the subject, but the sort of peripheral view of the subject, of a character or a scene. And that's Richard Hugo, the poet, talking about kind of writing at a 90-degree angle in a poem. You're going to hear me referencing poetry a lot. It's a thing I do. I also read poetry a lot, so that it keeps that kind of precision and that kind of surprise going in my own imaginative process.
Yeah.
But he always talked about writing off subject, because even if you think you're writing off subject in a poem, your subconscious, whatever it is that's working, will bring that into what the poem is dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And provides surprise, and it provides a kind of variety to the poetry that single-minded line might not provide otherwise.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the several students actually in the Airstream Dispatches program, which is reading your amazing collection, Labors of the Heart, right now, wanted to ask if you could share a little bit about the genesis for your stories. So, how an idea begins, if it's a word or a character or an image, and then from there, what does that unfurling look like?
Each story has a different kind of approach. I don't have any kind of standard approach to a story. I'm thinking about one of the stories you mentioned in your letter to me was Grounded, which was kind of a breakout story for me. Was one of maybe 3 real breakout stories for me was Grounded. And that came from when I was driving my son from Montana back to Wisconsin and leaving him there for college, right? And suddenly a separation of mother and son, and the heartbreak that's associated with it that you can't let on to. You can't admit it to them or yourself in some degree. And I thought back on times when he was a little bitty kid, about 5 years old, and he'd pack his bag and walk down the driveway and run away from home. And I'd follow him, and then we'd have a picnic lunch in the woods, and then we'd walk back. And it was kind of a game we played. But, that little idea was circulating in my head, like, what if he had been 15 at the time? What if? Would I follow him down the driveway? And the story took off from there. Stiff Soup was a story. It was an anecdote I'd heard from a friend who was a naturalist from a child on, and as a little kid he wanted to know if he could survive in the woods, so he ate a frog.
Mm-hmm. Huh.
And I hung on to that image of swallowing a frog for about 15 years before I found the way to make it story rather than just anecdote.
Wow.
Right. So I lived with that one in my head a long time, and I do tend to live with stories quite a while before they manifest themselves on the page. Labors of the Heart was a exercise I gave myself to write in a character that would be challenging to me, that morbidly obese man, cut off from everybody and everything, to imagine myself, or to imagine him so deeply that he became real. And so it was an exercise I just gave myself. Sometimes they're news articles, sometimes it's something I hear in conversation, other times it's just an image that pops in my head, and I'll start working on it.
Yeah. Great. You have a pet bird.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I have I love birds. It was an impulse buy. It was a bad buy. I've always had canaries, and I love the sound of a bird in the wintertime, and the delightful song of a canary, but they're so fragile. So I went to the pet store when Fred lost a canary and saw these sweet little lovebirds, and I asked the person, they're not noisy, are they? Because they're in the parrot family. She says, oh, they just chirp. But it's the loudest chirp you've ever heard. Yeah. And they lived for 15 years. We're 5 years into it. I've only got 10 more years with these sweet little
All right. Well, your name lovebirds. That's
yeah,
funny.
They're sweet, but they are noisy.
So another question that came from a reader was about research. And so certainly there's some research, like in stories involving taxidermy, for example. But in that case, when you're looking stuff up, does the research come first and then the narrative comes out, or do the characters take you somewhere and demand that you know the facts and start digging in?
It's worked both ways for me. With the short story, Mouse Rampant, I had the idea for writing about somebody doing taxidermy because I lived in Montana, and everywhere you went there was taxidermy. There were moose on the wall and cougar mounts, and so And I think the one that really did it for me is the time I went to the Lochsaw Lodge and they were cleaning the elk with a dustbuster. And it was just like, okay, I have to write this story about somebody doing taxidermy. So then I started researching taxidermy, and the more I read on it, the more complicated it got. So then one day I just decided to do it. So I had a friend who, her son fed the snakes at the University of Montana, and she brought me a frozen mouse. She brought me 6 frozen mice, actually, in a bag to work at Fact and Fiction Bookstore. And by the end of the day, they were thawed, and I had to do it. So I went home and at the kitchen table, and I taxidermied a couple little mice.
Wow.
Yeah, it was great fun, but the idea for the story started out from the viewpoint of the person doing the taxidermy. But then when my husband at that time, Dennis, came home and he didn't know anything about this, he'd been ice fishing all day. He walked into the house and he sees me at the kitchen table on his favorite cutting board with these 6 little mice all skinned. And it appalled him. He just, my God, what are you doing? You know? And at that moment, it was a revelation that the story's not about the taxidermy. The story's about the person who has to live with the taxidermist. So in that instance, it was the idea, the taxidermy itself, that drove the story, and then it morphed from there. With the novel Season of the Snake, it was the character who needed to have a career in which she handled dangerous things and felt competence in a dangerous world.
Yeah.
So snakes seemed a natural. Living out there, at least in Idaho.
Yeah. Season of the Snake. And that came out before Labors of the Heart, didn't it?
Yeah, it came out just a couple months before. It was a 2-book deal.
Oh, handy.
So I did lots of research on snakes, and I'm still not fond of them. And most of the research you do, 9/10 of the research you do, you will not use. But you have to do it all in order to know exactly what specific bit of research will serve that point in the story.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I experienced that researching war for sure. And sometimes it would be a whole day's work and just 1 or 2 facts or images, but they could make a scene, make a scene.
Exactly. And your life's better for it. You know something you didn't know before.
Totally.
So it's
Yeah.
waste,
Okay, so this one is pure selfishness, although I'm still wearing my Aramont name tag. Although I know that listeners will also be curious about this. So I've taken some classes, it's been a while now, but where people talk about this thing called exposition. And I've even looked around online, like what are people actually, what is the actual definition of that? And then that really got me nowhere. So that aside, I feel like I could look at an example of text and know it when I see it. Like, oh, that's that stitching. It's the narration of the story. It's the net that holds all those words.
It's the storyteller. It's the storyteller. Okay. It's most clearly illustrated in third person.
Okay.
As in first person, exposition tends to be within that first person's head as a meditation or an observation of something, because of course that story world is limited to the view of that central character, the I, right? But in third person, it's the storyteller sitting outside the world of story looking into it. And that third person narrator has a much larger view. So it can eclipse time, it can collapse things, it can move very quickly. Expositions generally move to get the pacing more quickly rather than full scene. There's 3 tools you can use. One is narrative exposition, and that's usually for a quicker pacing, to collapse time, to move a character through something quickly, to give information. Full scene slows time to discourse, like things happen slowly. Person sighs, lights a cigarette, leans back, says something. And then there's half scene, which is a mixture of both narrative exposition and full scene, where you'll have narrative exposition. It'll pause for maybe 2 or 3 sentences. It'll give a direct bit of dialogue, maybe some one telling image from a day, and then it'll go back into narrative exposition.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, perhaps the clearest way to understand narrative exposition is the storyteller sitting at the table with their elbows on the table, and they're telling you, and they're saying, where the character wouldn't think to look at a town and notice that the two churches are warring with one another for the parishioners because it's a small town, and their signboards are always at war with one another in strange ways. The third person narrator would look at the town and say, this is a small town. You can tell by the way the two churches war with one another. There's signboards doing this. It can give you culture. It can give you landscape. It can give you all sorts of things very quickly, pretty economically.
Mm-hmm.
And they can say things and they can know things that the character won't know.
And I feel like you can still do that here and there, even when you're in a limited third narrator.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
That short story generally employs limited third, not always.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's still that narrator outside of the story who can step back and give you that wider view of the world, you know. And it can get into the person's thoughts, but it can also step back and look at culture and look at landform. It can look at all sorts of relationships outside of that person's ability to talk about.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Okay, I've never heard it described that way. So 3 kinds: narrative exposition, full scene exposition, and half scene exposition.
Yeah.
And then I often talk about backstory, like little jabs of backstory.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like that you would describe that as narrative exposition.
Yeah. Unless you know, in some way the first person, generally narrative exposition. It can go into full scene though. You can do backstory and drop into full scene.
That becomes a flashback. Right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you can do that, or you can do that quick. 20 years ago she was married and this and that, and then pop back in the present scene. That would be narrative exposition.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Love that. Thank you. So much better than a Google search. It really is like that elusive thing too, at least to me and others who I met in the Flash world, because we got our legs by writing short. And then at a certain point you're done writing short, or you're asked to write a novel, and then it's like, oh wait, how do you...
Right. And so much flash fiction is handled almost exclusively in narrative exposition because it is fast, because its pacing is quick. There are some exceptions. I'm thinking of Colette's short flash fiction, The Other Wife. I'm not sure the title, but she has this piece of flash fiction, but it's full scene. It's like one scene and it's full scene. Yeah. But so often the flash fiction pieces will be almost entirely narrative exposition or half scene.
Yeah.
Because they're so brief. They have to move so quickly.
Yeah. Cool. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, 2 more questions. I give you a heads up on this one. I'd love to hear from you about a tiny moment of great significance in your life. So a sort of flash nonfiction of your own where you can remember before and after.
The word significant, I was going to say, this one I thought was like the hardest. I kept thinking of the word significant was really setting my hair on fire, because knowing what's significant, but I will say this. When I was just a really young child, really young, we had a lot of music in our home, and we had a grand piano. My mother insisted on music, and for whatever reason, one day she went out, and my father was we were just the lower middle class. He was a factory worker. She found a used piano for sale in the neighborhood, and it happened to be a grand piano. And every house we ever moved in after that had to accommodate this insanely grand piano. But it was a decent instrument, except for the very lowest range of that keyboard. I think it was the low A. When you struck that A, it was rather like sitting in a doctor's office and he used a little mallet and he bangs your knee and your knee jerks. You know what that feeling is, right? You could strike that note and your entire body would kind of do that twang. It was just a note that sent shivers down your spine. It was horrific. But I remember my cousins would come over of a day on the weekend, saying they'd hang with us and we'd all play, and the parents would be in the other room talking. We'd be at the piano. My older cousin Larry would sit at the piano and he'd hit those lower notes real softly, and he'd tell us scary stories.
Mm-hmm.
I was hitting those lower notes, and the scarier the story, the closer he got to that A. And then when he got to the heart of the bad story, that A would strike. And inevitably his story would, at least one of his stories, he had the pitchfork hanging on the wall in the basement. And we were kids, 5 years old, 6 years old, 9 years old at the time, and we all went running down to the basement. We all stood in the dark of the cellar and we looked at the pitchfork on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went screaming up the stairs like a flight of birds out into the sunlight, because it was just great fun. We'd scared ourselves. But so from the earliest days, somehow music, and that's not necessarily music, but it had to do with pairing story and sound. And learning piano all my life, I played piano all my life. Learning phraseology and learning intonation and inflection and all sorts of things from music, rhythm, and applying it to language, finding that same music and language.
Mm-hmm.
It's a gift of my parents. It really was.
Mm-hmm.
Although I do remember my mother also telling me, as when I was a burgeoning pianist at all of 8 years old, and I told her I was going to be a concert pianist, and she told me, no, girls can't be concert pianists.
Oh, wow.
Only men can work on the stage, and you can be a teacher and you can teach somebody to be a concert pianist, but you'll be a teacher.
Wow.
Yeah. So she was she was a very frustrated housewife.
Yeah. Well, you found your way to many stages, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So let's conclude with just a few quick book recommendations. Someone whose work wows you, or maybe that we wouldn't otherwise discover, that you would like to celebrate and mention here.
Flannery O'Connor, of course. Everybody knows of Flannery. She's one of my very first inspirations and driving force in my writing. But Melanie Ray Tone is amazing. In this light, her collection of short stories, its new and selected stories, is fabulous. Stuart Dybek's Coast to Chicago.
Oh.
Right? Maybe one of my all-time favorite books. There's just no getting past that one. It's a tour de force.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen Millhauser's The Knife Thrower,
mm-hmm.
which will, so many of these books I use for different things. For a Millhauser, it's camera movement on the page, the way he can take us into these realms that we wouldn't normally go through that narrative. He's amazing. Brady Udall's Letting Loose the Hounds. Love that collection. Anthony Doerr's The Shell Collector.
Mm-hmm.
Exquisite collection of short stories. Tim Gautreau. Welding with Children.
Okay.
It's a lovely collection. It's just brilliant and quite wonderful. Colin McCann's 13 Ways of Looking. Yeah. Kim Zupan, The Plowman, a novelist, very much in the same sort of vein as Cormac McCarthy.
Okay.
Brilliant use of landscape and language.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a great list. Thank you, Claire. And thank you for your time. And I know you're taking off tomorrow to do a big residency, so this is extra special to get half an hour with you.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun visiting with you. I'm glad we got all the technical worked out, and I hope you have a good time with your students. And thank your students for doing this. This is wonderful.
I will.